I'm Teresa Piacentini, and this short recording is really an opportunity to review topic 2, self society belonging, and think about the 6 key concepts that we've been looking at over the course of the 6 lecture recordings. In this topic, we've been thinking conceptually to help us to explore the relationship between self, society, and belonging. And this is important because, as I have argued and hopefully has become clearer, is that these are not separate entities. Now, we are not spectators in society, we are in it, we are it. And one of the ways we experience this being in society is through a sense of belonging or a lack thereof. Belonging is a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, and forming social bonds provide us with that sense, but are also belonging is also a mirror to understanding who we are. And if we think about the 6 key concepts we've been looking at, and I'm not going to, in this recording, provide a review of the key messages for each of those concepts. Rather, please do go back to the lecture recordings and also look at the different resources that have been posted on the storyboard for this topic, which hopefully bring to life some of the many issues that we've been covering. But rather, I want to think about these concepts in relation to this idea of belonging. So, looking at what we've covered thus far, exploring concepts such as identity, we have seen that identity is in fact inherently relational. It depends on how others and how we self identify and how we categorize. Identity produces contexts of belonging, which have both direct and indirect consequences for the relationship between self and society. Identification and categorization marks out belonging and not belonging. When we explored moral panics, it was argued that these are founded on the idea of fear. And when we have fear, we internalize our so called values and identify others who share them. So, a kind of belonging to a shared value system that is under threat. This affects collectively negotiated understandings of who we are and what we stand for. It provides a foundation for who then gets excluded as the other. And whilst the idea of belonging has undoubtedly become more complex, my point is that it was never easy or straightforward to begin with. Different people, categorized in different ways, have always been excluded or ostracized or told that they don't belong. And society's need to construct what Stanley Cohen famously wrote about as folk devils was as true then as it is now. When we think of impression management and the presentation of self, it is about asserting a sense of belonging. The Goffman self employs unwritten social rules to present a moral self. The self also responds to the situation, performing a particular role in relation to the rules of interaction to ensure we give the best impression of ourselves. We perform roles that assert a belonging to make us feel at ease and to avoid uneasiness. If you remember the study on performing motherhood, the 2 studies, these were as much about claims to belonging to collective understandings of particular moral behaviours, that is, good parenting, as they were about othering and about not performing roles that might mean not belonging. When we undertake emotional labour, we are connecting our individual self to society, looking at the world of work and through the world of work. And in this context, belonging requires people to adapt themselves in order to feel part of their environment, to fit into the workplace, and to suffer consequences if we do not. Emotional labour relates to the work we do to make others at ease with themselves and the work we do to make ourselves at ease in the process. Uneasiness then becomes about risk and is fraught with possibilities that puts us at risk. In discussing stigma, we considered the opposite of belonging. We considered this idea of othering and the different mechanisms that are behind stigmatizing forces, in critically engaging in a way that has compromised its meaning but also produced its own stigmatizing effects. So critically engaging with Goffman's account, I should say. When we do that, we resituate the concept historically, and we see how it has come to be bracketed off from wider power relations. Those very power relations that work very hard to define who belongs and who doesn't. And then we considered how, focusing on the stigmatized, the stigma knower, we can understand ways of resisting and asserting alternative forms of belonging, thus introducing transformative possibilities in shifting away from Goffman's apolitical and bracketed off account. And we looked at community, from given to chosen communities, communities of place and space, communities of ideas and actions. Belonging connects the self to society and works to include and exclude. We've explored how it manifests in material terms and in our understandings of how to exist. But we've also seen how, in the face of social change, not belonging can produce other forms of collectivization that can address exclusion and produce different types of relations between the self and society. And I want to just say a final point about the concepts. Although we've looked at these as separate, they should not be considered as self-contained or mutually exclusive. In fact, when we're thinking through identity, we can see there is a thread that runs with this idea of identity through moral panics, through the presentation of self, through our emotional labour, through stigmatising forces, and through community. And so what's really important when you look at each of these lectures is to think, well, how do I draw those threads across and through in order to better understand this relationship between self, society, and belonging? And just to kind of give a final recap, the argument when we think about categories and concepts isn't really about what ones we should use, but how we use them and who is using them and to what end and when they're being used and what are their effects. We need to recognise that there are analytical categories that, whilst we might not have alternatives, they are also deeply contested. And that as social scientists and sociologists in training, we adopt this critical stance towards the categories of practice we use and our categories of analysis. And if we remember that thinking sociologically requires us to develop skills in defining concepts and to use them carefully and rigorously to describe the social world around us. And sociological consciousness is debunking and relativizing, and the conceptual vocabulary we develop helps us to do this. It's really important then that we try to define sociological concepts clearly and precisely and use them in this very careful manner to help us describe and order and sort through the social world around us. These are all key aspects to thinking sociologically. So this section on using concepts, really, we are using concepts to help us think conceptually about our social world. And thinking sociologically with concepts helps us to develop our sociological imagination.